Hello, this is JB Helm, and thanks for tuning in. Are you writing a story or a group of scenes? I came out with I've been writing nonfiction for, going back since I was 20 years old, and I had columns and I wrote a lot of articles. I published books all about, certain niche that I was involved in, like pretty much my whole life, which is horse racing. And I always wanted to write a novel, so I wrote one years ago, put it out, and it really was just a bunch of scenes. So it didn't have a good plot. The ending wasn't good, so I pulled it off the market pretty quickly. And that's been bothering me for years. So the last about 15 months or so, I said, I'm going to try this again. So for this time, I'm going to do it right. So first thing I did is I created first, a beginning, a middle, and an end. I created an outline. I knew what the end was going to be, and I came out with my first Frankie Valentine thriller, The Valentine Protocol, which is on Amazon. And I just came out with the second one, Signal to Kill, which is also on Amazon. So, I was watching some of the videos. You see all these videos on YouTube, mistakes that writers make and everything. And somebody who's been in the publishing business for a long time was talking about that one of the most common mistakes that first-time novelists make is they have a book of scenes, and it doesn't really go anywhere. It doesn't, resolve at the end. And that's basically what I did in my first book years ago. And I wasn't going to make that mistake this time. I focused. I was like, this. I'm going to have a plot. When I think about it, though, going back to that other book, why didn't I, recognize that? I mean, I spent a lot of time in that book. But the thing is that sometimes you want to be original. You think, well, I'm going to be different. And there are writers who have these very unusual books that actually are successful, and not that many people really like them, but they have a niche. They have a group of readers that will actually read them, even though they're kind of confusing. But there aren't that many writers like that. I mean, most of the successful books are contemporary fiction in niches like thrillers, mysteries, fantasy. The books that people actually buy, and those books tend to be books that are easy to read, enjoyable. Usually the protagonist is maybe has some issues, but he's basically a good person. Otherwise, you don't have anyone to root for. But there are people that try to do something different. They'll have a protagonist who's not nice. What I did, years ago, of course, I read all the classics, the great books, by Hemingway or Faulkner and all these people. But then, I got around to mysteries and thrillers, and I really liked reading spy novels and mysteries. I read all the Agatha Christie and James Bond books, and the thing is about these books is you're rooting for the protagonist, and the protagonist has to solve a big problem, and if the people don't care about the person, it's really hard to keep their interest. So what I did the last like 10 years or so, as I was thinking to myself, I'm going to start a series that's going to be a lot better than the one I started years ago. And I thought about it, so I said, let me read a lot of thrillers. The guy who writes the Jack Reacher books, Lee Child, right? Is that his name? Yeah, Lee Child. That's what he says. Read a lot of books. He said he read a lot of thrillers before he wrote his first Jack Reacher novel. And his books have good hooks in them. They hook you right away in a good storyline. But I read a lot of modern thrillers, and you should read a lot in the niche that you want to write in. And even if the book isn't that good, the books that aren't that good that still do well, like you'll read a book and you'll say, geez, I don't really like this that much, but it's successful. It's pretty successful. May not be a bestseller, but they're selling books. That's good, because that's going to give you inspiration, because you're going to say, well, I can write as good as this. I can, and because there are a lot. I mean, I read a lot of thrillers over the last like 10, 12 years. Some of them were solid. There were quite a few good ones. There were a few really good ones, but there were a lot of them that were, they barely kept my interest. They didn't move along that well. Um, the thing is with with these books. Now I'm writing basically a short fiction, so it's like 163 pages. That's going to be my all my books are going to be like that. What I wanted to do is take advantage of my nonfiction writing skills. I worked for a newspaper years ago, where it was a daily newspaper, and I worked there for 5 years before I went out on my own business. And it was a deadline type of environment. The editor would hand you something and say, "Hey, front page story, need that in an hour." So you learn how to write concise. And the thing is, I like reading books like that. That's why those old mysteries too, like Dashiell Hammett, or Agatha Christie, or even the Bond books by Ian Fleming. Those are not big books. They're easy to read. They're not thick. And the thing is that every chapter and in almost every page moves the story along. There's not a lot of filler and just exposition and explaining how things look in great detail. It's story all the way through. And of course they have good character development too. So that's what the way I design these books. It's like this is how I'm going to succeed at this. Is I'm going to create a book that fits into my style of all this writing I've done all these years. Because I've published well over 1,000 articles and my own books and everything, nonfiction. So it's worked out good. Now I'm working on a new series too. So the last year and a half, as I was thinking about these stories and these characters, and I was taking notes, writing notes, and developing them. I also had a World War II, a post-World War II mystery, and a character in mind. And it's a lot of fun too. I'm so glad that I didn't write in the current time. These books here take place in the 1970s, the Frankie Valentine mysteries. And so it's much more fun because you have to research, like the one I'm writing that is post World War II. I'm learning things about that era in New York. That one takes place in New York. That I either forgot about or I never even knew. And so it's really interesting. So, and I don't have to deal with the hacker and the cell phones, which are in all the thrillers now. Everybody's got a hacker. They're hacking somebody's computer or something. It's much more fun going back and just dealing. And the thing is these characters, they can't just grab a cell phone. If they want to make a phone call, they have to find the phone. So, but it's just really important to have characters that people like. They can have flaws, and you have to have a plot, beginning, middle, of an end. Beginning, middle, and an end. And I always know now what the end is. I have the end all mapped out already, so I know where I'm going. And it's been a lot of fun. It's really been a lot of fun. I think that the video I was watching though, when he says a lot of people write a book of scenes, I think that's because they think they can be different. Now, going back to scenes though, scenes are important. They have to fit into the plot. But the thing is that to me, and when I'm writing these chapters, it has to be cinematic. If I can't picture my story being made into, say, a movie, it's not going to work. It has to be, because if you can't picture your story as as a movie, that means that you don't have cinematic scenes, which means that your scenes aren't exciting enough. Even if it's two people talking, which you're going to have in all books, it can't be mundane. And I threw a little romance in my books, and the dialogue between like Frankie Valentine and woman that like in this book, there's a woman named Trish who's a horse racing trainer, and the dialogue between him and her is kind of cool. Some of it's funny, some of it's romantic. There's just some flirting, and that keeps people's interest. Romance is popular in books, but it doesn't overshadow the suspense of the book and the main story. So anyway, I'm going to have more videos, and I'm really interested in what you think about modern fiction. Are there any thrillers that you really like? What kind of thrillers do you like? And if you're trying to write a novel, let us know. And thanks for tuning in again. This is JB Helm.